for those that are joining us. We will open up for questions after both presentations are done. So now I will be turning it over to Mary, who will be presenting on our nuclear past before us. Thank you, Mary. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Joy. That was great. What I really like about it is that you're sharing people's names and bringing the names of those organizations and those people, those women into this space. And with that, their kana or mana. And I really appreciate that. As Shannon said, my background is in social studies, and I love teaching history. Most of my history teaching has been at the intermediate level and middle school and the college level. And I really like the opportunities we have. So I want to share, you've got a lot of information about our nuclear past. And so I want to provide a framework for this for our social studies teachers here, all of our teachers in the audience, and for the students that I hope will get to see this. And I want to start by greeting you as we do on Guam, Hafaday. As many of you know, Guam is a territory of the United States. We have a very long colonial history with centuries as a colony of Spain. We were captured and occupied by the Japanese and are now an unincorporated territory of the United States. So a very long history of colonization, similar to many other places in the Pacific. Guam here is this is Micronesia, and in the upper left, you see the string of islands known as the Mariana Islands. We are politically two different entities. The Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, and it's a Commonwealth in association with the United States, and then the island of Guam, which is the southernmost and largest island. In September of this year, one of the most notable parts of current events, most notable current events for me as a Chamorro on Guam is that we were seeking recognition as downwinders. So Joy talked about the 66, 67 tests that were the United States did in the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Very serious impacts there, but let's not forget that the impacts were seen and felt to this day by those of us downwind. It's a history that's still very difficult for us to talk about, not openly discussed much outside of the RMI. And so that's, it's a current development in my mind, something that students might want to explore. And I think by exploring it and starting discussions about downwinders, it might be facilitate a path towards healing. And here's just a pull out. Guam is similar in shape to Molokai. If you flip Molokai over, slightly larger. Molokai's population, though, much smaller. We have about 130,000 people on Guam, so significantly more people on that island. Again, we are Chamorro, share the same language and cultural history as those in the Northern Marianas. For 14 years, I worked as a technology director, first female in charge of technology at a University of Hawaii campus. We have 10 campuses in the University of Hawaii system. Kapiolani Community College at its peak served over 10,000 students and 400 faculty and staff. And I was in charge of all of the technology. It was the only campus where technology management was centralized. So we ran everything from we had our own phone switch. manage computers in the classroom, in the cafeterias, the bookstore, and throughout. So, and we provided service for distance learning and professional development around technology. I was also a faculty in educational technology, and information computer science. I spent 2 years as the outreach director at the Center for Pacific Island Studies at Manoa, and then a year and a half at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Chaminade University, which actually has an AA and baccalaureate programs in partnership with the Caroline College and Pastoral Institute in the Federated States of Micronesia in Chuuk. And so I was helping faculty better understand and better serve Micronesian students there. I have been at the East-West Center now for 2 years. For the first year, I worked in education as a scholarship coordinator, and now am director of the Pacific Islands Development Program. And very happy to be at the East-West Center because our mission is to advance a peaceful, prosperous, and just Asia-Pacific region. We are also, the Pacific Islands Development Program is a unique entity. We are a Pacific-focused department within the East-West Center, which is a nonprofit think tank. And so we're a Pacific-focused department there, but we are also, what many people don't realize, we are the secretariat of what's known as the Pacific Islands Conference of Leaders, the heads of government of 20 island sovereign nations, territories, and the state of Hawaii. We convened the Pacific Island Conference of Leaders at the beginning of June. We had 11 heads of government from 11 island nations, territories in the state of Hawaii, 48 delegates. We will convene a standing committee in December. This is a way we can serve as a bridge between the United States and the Pacific. So I'm happy to be here today, serving in that role, and also want to share with the educators here that we are a resource, often overlooked resource, but we can also provide connections to those other nations through the Pacific Island Conference of Leaders. Our goal is to, in a couple of years, convene a Pacific Island Conference of Youth Leaders at the same time we convene the heads of government. And so we'll be in touch about that and work through the council. I want to share a framework before I get into the issues of nuclear activity in the Pacific. This is a Chamorro word, motna. There are similar words across indigenous cultures. Motna can mean front, something physically in front of you. It can also be used, so it's directional, but it's also a temporal term, referred to time, things that come before you in time and history. So it captures this meaning of before in both senses, physical and temporal. We believe that the time that lies ahead of us can best be understood when we think about that which came before us. And I think History Day is one of those events that really captures this and allows us to capitalize on this. Mona can also, when it's, depending on how it's used, there are certain phrases that change the meaning or make the meaning a little less abstract. So there's a term called para mona, P-A-R-A. Para mona means from now on or from this point forward. So when we use it that way, we're talking about something that can be carried into the future, not just for the current moment. And so everything that Joy has shared, I think she's reflecting on the past, but it's really a call to action for the future, to continue to be a collective, to use whatever talents and collaborative efforts we can to bring our people forward and to address these global issues. So when Mona is used with a verb, it implies something that will occur in the future. This is a unfurling fern. This is actually taken in Aotearoa. So Mona can mean the front and the past, but it can also mean what's behind us, right? So it really points to this notion of the koru, the unfurling fern. Life is a progression. It's not a circle. It's not a linear progression. It's a circle. Those who passed on return to us. Those who came before us are still with us. And so I like to think of that when I share spaces with folks like Joy, because she's bringing the history, the stories of all of these amazing women and leaders from our past into the present with us, and hopefully inspiring some of you young people to be leaders for the future. I use shells in some of these photos because I want you to think about history and History Day, your study of these stories, with this analogy of a shell. Soft-bodied mollusks, those creatures inside a shell, right? They have to create their home. This metaphor is also very significant for us Pacific Islanders who are living away from home. Sorry, I'm extremely homesick. So soft-bodied mollusks build their shells because they need safety, they need security, they need that hard exterior to protect them from the elements. The shell is actually created by a combination, an alchemical interaction between chemicals from the mollusk's own body and the ocean, elements in the ocean, right? So it's through that combination that the shell is made. The shell grows larger as the body of the mollusk grows, right? So the creature is growing, the creature is building its home as it goes. So the shell that a creature carries represents its past, its present, and its future. And so I think History Day it encapsulates that. Everything, all of the products that we see, that we generate, are elements of past, present, and future. And I think all of the students who participate, the teachers that work with them, their families that support them, are helping us shape the future, as in the present day we look to the past for lessons. Joy shared a lot of the nuclear history with you, and I want to highlight a few of the more recent events that are of great concern to many of us. And we shared today because these are events that are not well known, at least not in the circles that I travel in, not among the general public here in Hawaii and in America. So many of you remember in March, 10 years ago, March, there was an accident at the Tokyo Electric Power Company's holdings, Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station. So the accident, there was a triple meltdown. It was the worst nuclear crisis the world has seen since Chernobyl. The Japanese government and the Tokyo Electric Power Company now have to decide what to do with more than 1 million tons of contaminated water stored in about 1,000 giant tanks on the plant site. In December 2019, Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry announced that it was going to gradually release the water into the ocean, saying that a controlled discharge into the sea would stably dilute and disperse it. They ruled out other alternatives, and that released a firestorm of protest, not in the United States, not in Hawaii, This is a photo from an article. This looks like the Financial Times. I'll share all of the links with you to all of these articles. So these were demonstrators in Tokyo. Fishermen in Japan fear that if that water is released into the ocean, it'll ruin the fishing industry because it will contaminate the fish. And so the other concern is not just contamination of the fish, but creating a public perception that Japan is not an ethical or friendly nation to its Pacific neighbors, right? That it's deliberately placing us at risk, and that will have serious implications for national, international, and regional relationships. So even their own people are objecting to this. People in Seoul have protested for the same reasons that the Japanese fishermen and public protested. China is encouraging Japan to rethink this strategy. So even you've seen, we've seen some measure of discontent from China. So their neighbors are protesting. Greenpeace is also calling this into question, condemning this plan, saying that it's not only is it dangerous, but it's just a flagrant disregard for human rights, not just for Japan, but for the whole Asia Pacific region. As I said, many people in Hawaii, in the general public, have no knowledge of this. I don't know how well known it is among DOE teachers or other educators. So again, we really hope that you can share this information. That legacy of testing is very important. Many Americans know nothing about that. So that historical legacy is important, but our future, this present event that will actually happen in the near future, should also be brought to the attention of our general public. And if we can raise awareness through our schools, this will be great. One of the few media outlets, in fact, the only media outlet in the state of Hawaii who's willing to cover this, is the Honolulu Civil Beat, who has a Pacific journalism fellow from the, actually a Kiwi from Aotearoa, Thomas Heaton. He's here on a fellowship from an American institution, temporary, but his beat is the Pacific. So he's a great resource. Again, I'll share this, but you could also go to his Thomas Heaton Civil Beat page. He's also on Twitter, and he covered this, but he also covered many other events. In his coverage of this story, he reached out to members of the Pacific Islands Forum, the Secretariat, as well as members from Pacific countries, activists and members who have been in discussions with the government of Japan. So the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat has been working on behalf of some Pacific nations and set up briefings with the government of Japan and scientists. The problem with the briefings, the problem that even the Japanese government and the power company have admitted, is that much of the data that they're providing on their websites and in reports is inaccessible. It's just too technical for normal people to understand. So I found some documents that are not as technical, and I'll share that with you. That'll be in the Padlet. One of the interesting recent events is that the House of Representatives of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands issued a statement blasting this plan. This was just October 7th, so this is very recent. What's significant is that the Northern Marianas receives a lot of aid from the Japanese government. So this took a lot of strength, and we're really proud of our brothers and sisters in CNMI for speaking up. This is not the first time Japan has attempted or has floated a plan like this. Back in, I think it was 83, find that for you so I get the right date. I believe it's in 83 or 84. The Japanese government had a plan, 1983, 84. At that point in time, it had 25 nuclear reactors. The US at that point had 70, and Japan planned to dump 100,000 curies of low-level nuclear waste in the Pacific Ocean. And so the Japanese have, this is not the first time they've tried this. So again, it's very important for us to always look back to the past because that informs present day decisions that will impact our futures. In 84, Tasiwa Nakamura from Palau, the speaker of the legislature, traveled to Guam to meet with Japanese scientists and members of the Japanese government to condemn this plan. That was back in the early 80s. I think I was in high school at that point. And he said, you don't throw the seeds of a poisonous fruit into the yard of your neighbor. It was again, as Joy pointed out, a point in time where Pacific Islanders came together and stood together to voice their concerns and objections. Rhea Moss Christian is a young woman you should all follow. She's on Twitter. She represents some of the Pacific nations in these current present-day negotiations with Japan around the plan to once again dump nuclear waste into our oceans. And so she says, no matter how minimal the risk, because the Japanese government and their scientists claim that the risk is in fact minimal, it's difficult to accept that our backyard should be a dumping ground for our neighbors' toxic waste. So we see this theme of other nations, our supposed allies, looking to the Pacific as their dumping ground. The second current event that is of concern, and this occurred, shortly after our Pacific leaders called for a nuclear-free Pacific, and some leaders are saying nuclear-free, not just nuclear weapons-free. They see any use of nuclear-powered submarines as a threat to the well-being of the Pacific. Shortly after convening of Pacific leaders, where one of our leaders called for no nuclear-powered anything in the Pacific, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the government of Australia signed an agreement for nuclear-powered submarines to be supplied to Australia, right, in the Pacific, a Pacific nation. If you do a Google search on this alliance, what's the Australia, UK, US alliance, pages and pages of news articles, because many people, many nations are objecting to this. This is raising a red flag, not just among Pacific nations, but among our allies. There's an article that I'll provide a link to. And this is from, I think this is from oh, I'm sorry, did I accidentally stop screen sharing? Sorry, let me get back to that. So this is from the Diplomat, but a professor of engineering, a sinologist, an ex-diplomat, non-resident fellow of the Center for China and Globalization in the National University of Sciences and Technology in Pakistan, Professor Zamir Ahmed Awan. And he says that we need to we don't need more nuclear activity in the region, that we need more peace and prosperity in the region, and that it is every individual's responsibility to raise our voice and bring awareness of what he thinks is the beginning. So he thinks this deal with Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States is the beginning of a human-made disaster, that this may actually trigger a nuclear arms race in the Pacific region. And again, you know, it's raising public awareness is one way that we can work against this. So you've got two significant events happening in our region that many people are not aware of, that we need to speak out against. You know, and again, we go back to the history of those movements that Joy shared with us. Collectively, we can avert these man-made disasters. All peace-loving nations and individuals must join forces to neutralize these kinds of deals and arrangements. And that's part of the goal for today's session with all of you. And today, more than ever, I think that our past is actually before us, and hope that these talks and this space helps facilitate additional discussions, more questioning, perhaps more collaborative action to keep our world a safer place, keep the Pacific nuclear free. Mahalo.
Thank you so much, Mary. Wow, what an important presentation that you shared with us today. So now I'm going to